What unfolds when a conceited receptionist attempts to embarrass a modestly dressed guest at a lavish New York hotel, unaware that the woman is actually Taylor Swift? To make matters worse, she is oblivious to the fact that Keanu Reeves is about to enter the hotel and dramatically change the situation in an unexpected way. You won't believe how this evening concludes. Before we proceed with this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because we have another special story for you tomorrow. The rain battered New York City that November night, turning the streets into shimmering mirrors reflecting the vibrant glow of streetlights and neon signs. Pedestrians hurried along the slick sidewalks, umbrellas tilted against the steady downpour. But one woman walked alone, her head low beneath the hood of her sweatshirt. The black cap she wore was a deliberate choice, a quiet shield against recognition. Taylor Swift took a deep breath as she approached the grand entrance of Baccarat, one of the city's most exclusive hotels. Fatigue weighed on her shoulders, yet her mind remained sharp. She needed a quiet retreat, a place to gather herself before an important event the following morning. It should have been simple, just check in and get some rest. But for someone like her, it rarely was. The moment she stepped through the revolving doors, a wave of warmth greeted her. The air was laced with the subtle aroma of jasmine and vanilla. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow across polished marble floors, while a pianist played a soft, melodious tune in the background. This was a place designed for those who sought luxury, discretion, and exclusivity. Taylor moved toward the reception desk. Behind it stood a young woman with an air of precision about her. Her posture impeccable, her uniform crisp, and her gaze meticulously assessing each arriving guest. The golden name tag pinned to her blazer read, Rose. Rose barely concealed her skepticism as Taylor approached. Her gaze flickered over the actress's simple outfit, an oversized sweatshirt, comfortable jeans, and well-worn sneakers. Taylor could almost hear the silent judgment forming in the receptionist's mind. "Good evening. How may I assist you?" Rose's voice was smooth, but carried a note of hesitation, as though she had already decided this guest did not belong. Taylor met her gaze with quiet confidence. "I have a reservation under the name T. Anna." Rose's well-manicured fingers danced over the keyboard, her eyes scanning the computer screen with what seemed to be surgical precision. A slight furrow appeared between her brows. "We don't have any VIP reservations under that name." Taylor had expected this. A flicker of amusement crossed her mind as she maintained her patient smile. "I can show you the confirmation," she offered. Retrieving her phone and pulling up the email, she extended the device toward Rose. Rose hesitated before taking a cursory glance. Instead of acknowledging the confirmation, she exhaled softly, an almost imperceptible sigh of annoyance, before reaching for the phone on the desk, as if preparing for something more important. Taylor recognized the look in Rose's eyes. She had seen it before. It was the look of someone who judged first and asked questions later. Finally, Rose spoke again, her tone clipped. "Oh, of course. Let me check again." Yet, there was an unmistakable edge to her voice, something laced with subtle condescension. An uncomfortable silence settled between them as Rose continued typing. Across the lobby, a few guests had begun to notice the interaction. Nothing drew attention quite like an encounter thick with unspoken tension. Taylor folded her arms, waiting. She could feel Rose's gaze deliberately avoiding hers. And then, in a single sentence, Rose made a miscalculation that would change everything. "This hotel is for exclusive clients. Perhaps there's been some mistake." The implication was crystal clear. "Maybe you don't belong here." Taylor blinked slowly, absorbing the words. She was accustomed to being recognized in airports, at events, even in random coffee shops. But in this moment, Rose had no idea who she was speaking to, and maybe that was for the best. Or maybe not. Rose kept her fingers poised over the keyboard, her expression neutral but telling. Taylor knew exactly what was happening. This was not an oversight. This was a deliberate act. Rose had decided the woman in front of her did not meet the standards of Baccarat. "I'm quite sure the reservation was made here," Taylor said, her voice calm but firm. Rose's smirk barely wavered. "Well, our system isn't showing any confirmation under your name, but I can recommend a more affordable hotel a few blocks from here." Taylor remained composed, but the shift in the room was unmistakable. The couple by the fireplace had stopped their conversation. The man at the bar had lowered his drink, curiosity flickering in his eyes. This was no longer just a check-in issue. This was a spectacle. Rose wasn't simply denying a reservation. She was rejecting Taylor. "You didn't even check the system properly, did you?" Taylor asked, her tone still level, but now tinged with steel. Rose blinked, momentarily thrown off. "I'm just following procedures, ma'am. If you'd like, you're welcome to wait while I verify again." Taylor could see through the act. Rose was playing a game of power. Taking a slow breath, Taylor decided it was time to end this. "Is your manager available?" Rose's smirk deepened ever so slightly. "He's busy, but I can try checking once more." She turned her monitor slightly, as if genuinely looking something up. But Taylor caught the reflection in the glass behind the desk. The screen was still on the homepage. Rose wasn't searching for anything. Irritation burned in Taylor's chest, but before she could respond, a faint click echoed across the room. Taylor's gaze flicked to the bar. A man in a tailored suit held his phone at chest level, pretending not to have just taken a photo. Recognition had dawned in his eyes, and if he recognized her, others soon would. The weight of exposure settled in. This wasn't just about a botched reservation anymore. This was about control, and her smirk grew. She sensed Taylor's vulnerability. "Miss Anna, why don't you wait in the lounge while we sort this out? I'm sure we can find something for you." The humiliation was now complete. Taylor's fingers twitched slightly, but before she could respond, another receptionist approached Rose and whispered something in her ear. Rose stiffened. Her gaze flicked from Taylor to the man at the bar, then back to Taylor's phone. Suspicion crept into her expression. But before she could say another word, the hotel doors swung open with force. A cold gust of wind swept into the lobby, carrying raindrops that shimmered under the golden glow of the chandeliers. The atmosphere shifted. Rose's head snapped toward the entrance. The security guard by the door straightened his stance. Conversations halted. Every head turned, and then he walked in, dressed in a tailored black suit and crisp white shirt. His presence commanded attention. His shoes, slightly damp from the rain, barely made a sound against the marble floor. Yet, every step he took felt weighted with purpose. His eyes swept across the room, taking everything in within seconds. Then, they found Taylor. The baseball cap she wore still shadowed part of her face, but it didn't matter. The moment their eyes met, a silent exchange passed between them, heavy with meaning. Rose swallowed hard. She didn't need confirmation. She could feel it in the air. Taylor didn't have to say a word. The man strode directly toward her, ignoring everyone else. The lobby fell silent, thick with unspoken tension. Then, with a soft, knowing smile, he spoke. "Is everything good here?" His voice was smooth, deliberate, but the impact of those words rippled through the space like a shockwave. She didn't need to ask who he was. Everyone knew. His name hadn't been spoken, yet the weight of his presence made it unnecessary. And in that moment, Rose understood one thing with crystal clarity. She had just made a mistake she would never forget. Keanu took a deep breath, his sharp gaze cutting through the tension. He looked at Rose, then did something no one in the room saw coming. The lobby of Baccarat was dead silent, the kind of silence that thickened the air, making it hard to breathe. Moments ago, Rose had been in control. Now, she was suffocating under the weight of her own actions. Because the man standing in front of her wasn't just any guest. It was Keanu Reeves. Perfectly tailored black suit, crisp white shirt, and shoes still damp from the rain. He exuded effortless elegance, a presence so magnetic it shifted the entire room's energy in an instant. But what truly made Rose's breath hitch wasn't just his name. It was the way he looked at Taylor. "Did I take too long?" he asked, his voice low, laced with subtle amusement. The words landed like an electric current, jolting everyone in the lobby. Rose blinked rapidly, trying to process what she was witnessing. Taylor, the woman she had just dismissed, the woman she had humiliated minutes ago, was now the center of attention. And Keanu Reeves was talking to her with a familiarity that shattered every assumption Rose had made. Taylor let out a slow breath, a small, knowing smile forming. "Oh, You know how much I love a good patience test." Keanu's eyes sparkled. The room remained motionless. People barely dared to blink. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant, and Rose stood frozen, her face draining of color. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Across the lobby, near the fireplace, a couple exchanged stunned glances. Emily, a woman with brown hair tied into a casual bun, widened her eyes. She nudged her husband's arm. David, who had been watching with mild curiosity, frowned. "What?" Emily looked at Taylor, then at Keanu, and suddenly it clicked. She gasped, "David! Oh my God, I think it's her." David turned sharply, his breath hitching. "No way." Emily swallowed hard. What would she be doing here? David's jaw tightened. Maybe trying to have a quiet night, and look how that turned out. Rose's pulse pounded. She could feel the weight of the room shifting against her. People were realizing, and once they realized, there was no undoing it. Taylor Swift wasn't just any guest, and Rose had just treated her in the worst way possible. At the bar, the same man who had secretly snapped a photo earlier hesitated. Should he take another? Start recording? Because whatever was happening right now was about to become a scandal. Rose's body went rigid. She had to fix this. Now. Of course, sir. I can check," she stammered, forcing herself to focus on the screen in front of her. She started typing frantically, searching for the reservation she had so easily dismissed just minutes ago. She prayed for a miracle. Keanu crossed his arms, waiting. Taylor said nothing. She simply watched. And that was worse than any outburst Rose could have imagined. It wasn't rage in Taylor's eyes. It was something else. Something colder. Exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that came from experiencing the same treatment so many times that it no longer surprised you. Rose's fingers trembled as she finally located the reservation. Relief flooded her, and she tried to plaster a smile on her face. "Here it is," she whispered, voice barely steady. "Just a system error." Taylor raised an eyebrow. "Oh, a system error?" Rose turned red. She could feel the scrutiny, the judgment in every pair of eyes locked onto her. Keanu let out a short, humorless chuckle. The sound alone was enough to make Rose's stomach drop. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hall. The hotel manager appeared, his face pale, as if he already knew something was terribly wrong. His eyes darted from Keanu to Taylor to Rose. He didn't need to ask. He could read it in the air. The entire lobby waited for Keanu's reaction. Rose, desperate, scrambled to redeem herself. "Mr. Reeves, I deeply apologize for any confusion," she rushed out, forcing a tight-lipped smile. She turned toward Taylor, her voice shaking slightly. "Miss Anna, I want to assure you that your stay will be perfect." She was grasping for a lifeline, but there was no lifeline to be found, because when she looked at Taylor again, she saw what everyone else in the lobby saw. The humiliation couldn't be erased. It had already happened, and the damage was done. Keanu took a deep breath. Rose flinched, and then he did something no one in the room saw coming. The silence in the grand lobby of Baccarat was suffocating. It stretched and wrapped around every onlooker, thick with tension. Every pair of eyes was locked onto Keanu Reeves. Rose, who had commanded the situation just moments ago with the cool, effortless authority of someone who had the power to deny or grant entry, now looked like a wax statue, her confidence shattered in an instant. The shift had been almost imperceptible at first. Just a breath, a pause. But then the weight of the moment came crashing down, and she realized she had no control left. Keanu had taken it from her the moment he stepped into the hotel. Beside him, Taylor Swift remained composed, but her gaze spoke volumes. There was no pleading, no desperation. Only the kind of quiet certainty that came from years of knowing exactly how the world worked. She had been here before, in different forms, in different places. This was nothing new. And yet, that didn't make it any less infuriating. Keanu let out a measured sigh, running a hand through his slightly damp hair, still slick from the rain outside. The lobby remained frozen in anticipation. The hotel manager, a man in a well-tailored navy suit, looked like he was about to faint. He understood the gravity of the situation better than anyone. Rose's colleague at the reception desk had abandoned her screen, fingers hovering above the keyboard, staring at her with a mix of sympathy and apprehension. She knew. Everyone knew. Rose swallowed hard, forcing a smile that did nothing to mask the tremor in her voice. "Mr. Reeves," she started, her voice unnaturally high. "I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding. We are resolving everything." Taylor's arms crossed. Her voice was even, but there was an edge to it. "Oh, now you're resolving it." Rose's throat went dry. "Yes, it was just a system error. You know how these things happen sometimes." She let out a nervous laugh, but the sound was hollow, swallowed by the silence that followed. No one laughed with her. No one smiled. Keanu didn't smile either. The security guard near the entrance took a small step forward, instinctively sensing the weight of the moment. The energy in the room had shifted. Something was about to happen. Keanu uncrossed his arms slowly, placing both hands on the reception desk, directly in front of Rose. His stance was relaxed, but the intensity in his gaze made her shrink. "Let me ask you something," he said, his voice low, calm, but sharp as a blade. Rose straightened up, a forced professional composure taking over. "Yes, sir." Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying her. Would this system error have happened if I hadn't arrived? The color drained from Rose's face. The words sliced through her like cold steel, because everyone in that room already knew the answer. No, it wouldn't have. If Taylor had been alone, Rose never would have admitted the error. She would have dismissed her, sent her away to another hotel, another excuse, another fabricated problem. Because she could. Rose opened her mouth, but nothing came out. There was no excuse she could conjure that would make the truth disappear. She felt the walls closing in, the weight of the silent judgment pressing down on her like a vice. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. The hotel manager finally stepped forward, clearing his throat, desperate to take back control of the situation. "Miss Swift, Mr. Reeves, please allow me to express our deepest apologies." Rose turned to him, hoping, praying, that he would offer her an escape, a way out of this humiliation. But the manager didn't even glance at her. His focus was solely on Keanu and Taylor. "This is not how we treat our guests," he continued, his voice firm. "I assure you, this situation will be corrected immediately." Rose felt herself shrink further, her stomach twisting into a not-so-tight it hurt. Keanu remained silent for a long moment, letting the weight of the question linger. Then, his gaze flicked back to her. "And what if it had been someone else?" he asked. "What if Taylor wasn't famous? If she was just another traveler? Would you have treated them the same way?" The question hit harder than the last. The lobby was so quiet that the distant hum of traffic outside felt deafening. Rose could feel every single pair of eyes on her, waiting, watching, knowing. And the worst part? She had no answer. Because the answer was obvious. Taylor sighed softly, breaking the unbearable silence. "This happens all the time." The manager shifted uncomfortably. He knew. Of course he knew. But knowing and admitting were two very different things. Keanu straightened, shifting his attention from Rose to the manager. "Taylor should have been in a room 20 minutes ago." The manager nearly stumbled over himself in his eagerness to respond. "Why, yes, of course. We're handling everything right away." Rose's hands shook slightly as she typed into the system, her fingers stiff and clumsy. The room keycards printed out, and she slid them across the desk, willing herself to appear unaffected. "Here they are." Taylor took them without another word. Rose waited, hoped, for a parting phrase. Maybe an "it's okay," or a "these things happen." But it never came. Taylor didn't look at her again, and somehow, that cut deeper than anything she could have said. Rose didn't move. She remained frozen behind the reception desk, fingers pressing so hard against the polished wood that her nails nearly left marks. What had just happened replayed in her mind on an endless, agonizing loop. Keanu Reeves hadn't raised his voice. Taylor Swift hadn't needed to say much at all. And yet, the impact was devastating. Keanu picked up Taylor's small suitcase and turned toward the elevator. The couple by the fireplace still watched in stunned silence. The man at the bar, the one who had taken a picture earlier, didn't take another. He didn't need to. The moment had already been immortalized. As the elevator doors slid shut behind Keanu and Taylor, Rose felt the weight of the entire night collapse onto her shoulders. She had just made the biggest mistake of her career, and she knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. Rose felt the shift in how people looked at her. Before, she had been the gatekeeper of this grand establishment. Now she was just the woman who had tried to humiliate Taylor Swift and failed, miserably. The hotel manager took a deep breath, his expression unreadable. But Rose knew what was coming before he even spoke. "Rose, come with me. Now." Her stomach twisted violently. "Mr. Williams, he raised a hand, cutting her off. "Not here. In my office." The lobby remained eerily still as Rose stepped around the counter. She felt every set of eyes on her. Every step toward the glass doors leading to the administrative offices felt heavier than the last. When the door shut behind them, the air in the office felt even heavier. The manager exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples before fixing his gaze on her. "Mr. Williams, it was all just a misunderstanding. I swear, I couldn't find the reservation in the system. Don't lie to me, Rose." The words were quiet, but they hit harder than anything else that night. Rose's mouth opened, then closed, because there was nothing left to say. And for the first time that evening, she realized the damage she had done might just be irreversible. Rose had a sinking feeling before the manager even spoke. She could see it in his posture, the way he leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled, as if bracing himself for what came next. "The news is already spreading," he said grimly. Her eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Wordlessly, he turned his monitor toward her. On the screen was a social media post that sent a fresh wave of panic crashing over her. A high-resolution photo of the Baccarat hotel lobby, the post title burning itself into her vision. The Baccarat receptionist tries to humiliate Taylor Swift, and Keanu Reeves steps in to shut it down. Rose felt the air rush from her lungs. With trembling fingers, she scrolled through the flood of comments, each one more damning than the last. "Wow, this happened today? The hotel must be ready to fire this woman." Keanu being Keanu, saving the day as always. Has she lost her job yet? Because honestly, after this, Rose's face drained of color. This can't be happening. The manager's expression remained firm. "It happened, Rose, and now the hotel has to respond." He took a measured breath before delivering the words she dreaded most. "You're fired." The impact was brutal, a sharp, merciless stab to the chest. Rose felt cold, as if all the warmth had been sucked from the room. "Mr. Williams, no?" She lurched forward, desperate. "I've dedicated years to Baccarat. This was just a mistake." He stood, cutting her off. "A mistake? You weren't just rude to a guest, Rose. You tried to turn her away. You humiliated her. And what if it had been someone without a famous name?" She had no answer, because she knew the truth. If Taylor Swift had been an unknown, she wouldn't have thought twice about dismissing her. Williams pointed at the screen. "Baccarat cannot be associated with this kind of scandal. Your termination is immediate." The words felt final, like the slamming of a heavy door. Rose wanted to argue, to plead for another chance, but deep down, she knew it was futile. She left the office with blurred vision. The walk to the exit felt endless, each step heavier than the last. The weight of 1,000 judgmental eyes pressed against her back. She grabbed her things, her conscience gnawing at her like never before. As she crossed the lobby, guests whispered. The ones who had seen the ordeal unfold earlier were now relishing its conclusion. Her shame burned hotter than ever. When she reached the grand entrance, she paused. The security guard, a man she had passed 100 times before without a second thought, simply watched her. He didn't say anything, but his eyes spoke volumes. She stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool drizzle of rain kissing her skin. She didn't bother to shield herself. What was the point? Without direction, without purpose, she walked. A few hours ago, she had been the receptionist at a luxury hotel. Now, she was the cautionary tale. The example of what happens when you judge someone without knowing who they really are. And the internet would never forget. Meanwhile, back inside the Baccarat lobby, the chaos had settled. The front desk had switched shifts. The manager had given strict orders to ensure Taylor Swift and Keanu Reeves received nothing but the finest service. Emily, the staff member who had recognized Taylor earlier, sat at the bar with her husband, still shaking her head in disbelief. "I bet Rose will never judge someone by their appearance again," David chuckled, swirling the wine in his glass. "If she even gets another job anywhere, that is." Emily glanced toward the elevators where Taylor and Keanu had disappeared hours ago. She had no idea who she was dealing with, and now she's paying the price. Upstairs, in the luxurious suite, Taylor Swift sat at the edge of the massive king-sized bed, lost in thought. The exhaustion from her travels had caught up to her, but the lobby incident still played in her mind. Across the room, Keanu stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, gazing at the city lights. "She got what she deserved," he said, not turning around. Taylor sighed. "Maybe, but what really bothers me isn't what she did to me. It's knowing that this happens to people all the time. People who don't have someone to step in and save them." Keanu finally turned, studying her face. She looked distant, yet thoughtful. He crossed the room and settled into the armchair across from her. "You know you can't carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, right?" She let out a small laugh. "That's rich, coming from you." He smiled. "You probably don't remember, but when I was just another struggling actor, trying to make it, I went to this event. A party. One of those places full of important people. You were one of the only ones who stopped to talk to me. Treated me like I mattered." Taylor was silent. She tried to pull the memory from her mind, but she couldn't recall the exact moment. But that didn't mean it wasn't true, because it was the kind of thing she would do. She swallowed, touched by his words. Keanu's smile was soft. Maybe now it was my turn to return the favor. The next morning, when Taylor and Keanu entered the lobby, a hush fell over the staff. Conversations dipped into silence. The manager, Mr. Williams, rushed over, his expression carefully composed. "Mr. Reeves, Miss Swift, on behalf of Baccarat, I would like to offer you a complimentary stay and a special dinner as an apology for what happened." Taylor smiled politely. She picked up her suitcase and exchanged a look with Keanu. "We appreciate the offer, Mr. Williams, but I think this time, we won't be staying any longer." The manager forced a smile, though the discomfort was evident in his eyes. Keanu picked up his own luggage and followed Taylor to the exit. As they passed the front desk, some staff members discreetly lowered their heads. No one wanted to make eye contact. The car waiting for them glided smoothly through the streets, the hotel now a memory in the rearview mirror. Taylor glanced over. "And Rose? Do you think she learned anything?" Keanu exhaled, resting his arm along the back of the seat. "She has a choice, learn from it or drown in her pride. It's up to her." Taylor chuckled softly. "Do you always have this zen outlook on life?" Keanu shrugged. "I've seen a lot. I know that some people never change, but others? They just need a shock to see the world differently." Taylor's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. A message from a friend. A video. She smiled. Keanu arched an eyebrow. "What is it?" She shook her head, still smiling. "Nothing. Just a little seed being planted." Keanu smirked. "See? Told you it would make a difference." If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more. Thank you for watching. If you missed our last story, don't worry, I've got you covered. I'll leave it here for you to watch. Hope you enjoy it. What occurs when a conceited flight attendant, fixated on status and authority, attempts to belittle a reserved passenger in a shabby jacket on a private jet, only to realize she's dealing with Keanu Reeves himself? You won't believe how this flight concludes. Before we proceed with this tale, let us know where you're tuning in from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The private jet sat on the lit runway, awaiting its exclusive travelers. The sky, painted in hues of orange and purple by the setting sun, added a cinematic touch to the scene. Elegantly dressed men and women strolled across the red carpet leading to the aircraft entrance, their smug smiles, expensive fragrances, and confident strides revealing their elite status. Amidst this display of luxury, a man in a simple coat and worn backpack ascended the metal stairs without drawing attention. His shoulders were relaxed, his steps measured, and his expression calm, almost detached. With slightly messy dark hair and an unshaven beard, he seemed out of place among these polished figures. Keanu Reeves walked down the spacious aisle, discreetly observing the cabin. Beige leather seats, minimalist chandeliers, and even a small bar on the side composed the refined environment. The other passengers were already seated, engaged in superficial conversations about business investments and their latest extravagant acquisitions. Flight attendant Jack Wayne, impeccably dressed, conducted her usual assessment of the passengers. With years of experience on private flights, she had developed a keen instinct for recognizing who was who on board. Her sharp eyes scanned the cabin, evaluating each person based on appearance and posture. When her gaze landed on Keanu, she frowned slightly. Something didn't fit: the worn-out coat, the old backpack slung over his shoulder. He definitely didn't look like someone who belonged there. She watched as he settled into one of the spacious seats, gazing out the window with the serenity of someone used to traveling, but something felt off. Jacqueline approached another flight attendant and whispered, unable to hide her suspicion, "Are you sure they checked the passenger list?" Her colleague looked at her, surprised. "Of course, he's on the list." She cast another critical look at Keanu, biting her lower lip. Maybe he was an assistant to someone important, a personal aide to a tycoon. Keanu, in turn, noticed the flight attendant's suspicious gaze. His dark eyes met hers briefly, and he simply smiled faintly, saying nothing. The engines purred softly as the aircraft door closed and the cabin prepared for takeoff. Jacqueline followed her usual protocol, ensuring all passengers were comfortable. She offered champagne to a pair of business people in the front row, then moved on to another group of excited investors. But when she passed Keanu, she pretended not to see him. He didn't react. He only tilted his head slightly, as if finding the situation amusing. The plane gained speed on the runway, and within seconds, it was airborne, leaving the city behind. Jacqueline stole another discreet glance at Keanu. She still didn't understand what this man was doing there. Little did she know that this silent, seemingly ordinary passenger was about to change her life forever. Jacqueline's eyes narrowed. What is this guy doing here? Little did she know that this simple passenger was about to change her life forever. The plane glided smoothly through the sky as the passengers settled comfortably into their luxurious seats. The in-flight service had begun, and Jacqueline, as always, maintained her impeccable posture. She moved gracefully down the aisle, holding a bottle of expensive champagne, filling the glasses of the most important passengers. The clinking of crystal and hushed laughter blended with the ambient hum of the flight. When she reached the row where Keanu was seated, her gaze passed right over him as if he were invisible. She didn't even bother to offer him a drink. Keanu watched the scene calmly. He didn't seem surprised, let alone offended. He simply folded his hands in his lap and waited. She didn't just ignore him. She made a point of showing that he didn't belong in that environment. Taking advantage of a moment when she passed by him, Jacqueline decided to take another step in putting him in his proper place. She stopped beside Keanu's seat and, in a professional but slightly condescending tone, said, "Sir, this area is reserved for exclusive clients. There are available seats in the back of the cabin." Keanu lifted his gaze to her, his face calm, but his eyes seemed to see beyond the surface. "I'm fine here, thank you." His response was firm, but without any trace of confrontation. That irritated Jacqueline. She was used to passengers who simply obeyed her instructions without question. For a moment, she hesitated. But then she decided it wasn't worth insisting and moved away, muttering something inaudible to the other passengers. The businessman who'd been watching the scene now followed everything with even greater interest. He noticed Keanu's composed demeanor and the way he handled the disdain without reacting, without retaliating. This made him frown once more. A few minutes later, Jacqueline returned, pushing the beverage cart down the aisle. Her expression was impassive, but inside, her patience was wearing thin. As she passed by Keanu, he shifted slightly, unaware that his shoulder would lightly brush against the cart. It was almost an imperceptible contact, but Jacqueline saw an opportunity. With a quick motion, she tilted one of the bottles on the cart, spilling an entire glass of ice water over Keanu. The liquid soaked his coat and part of his shirt. A collective gasp swept through the cabin. "Oh, what a clumsy mistake," Jacqueline said in a falsely apologetic tone, though a small, satisfied smirk lingered at the corner of her lips. All eyes were now on Keanu. He looked down at his wet clothes, took a deep breath, and then lifted his gaze to Jacqueline. He said nothing. He just stared at her. But there was something in the way he looked at her, a firm, intense gaze that sent a chill down the flight attendant's spine, perhaps because of the discomfort of his stare, or maybe out of frustration that someone like him refused to feel inferior. Jacqueline crossed her arms and said louder than necessary, "You're a fraud. You don't even belong here." The nearby passengers stopped their conversations. The businessman furrowed his brows even deeper. "I've seen this before," Jacqueline continued, her expression full of disdain. "People who don't belong to this lifestyle trying to fit in. They think they can fool others for a while, but they're always exposed in the end." She tilted her head, analyzing him as if inspecting a defective product. "Are you even American?" Silence filled the cabin. Keanu remained still, his gaze fixed on her, but something in the atmosphere shifted. The businessman watching him raised an eyebrow. He was about to say something when he noticed that Keanu had not yet reacted, and that was when Jacqueline, for the first time, felt a flicker of regret creep up her spine. The way he looked at her. It wasn't anger, it wasn't humiliation. It was as if he already knew exactly what was about to happen next. Keanu looked at his wet clothes, then raised his eyes to Jacqueline. He said nothing, but the way he stared at her sent a chill down her spine. Silence hung in the cabin like a razor's edge, ready to cut. All eyes were on Keanu and Jacqueline. The passengers around them barely dared to breathe, sensing that something was about to unfold. Jacqueline stood with her arms crossed, her lips pressed tightly together. She was expecting a reaction, an explanation, maybe even an apology. But Keanu said nothing. He just watched her. That irritated her more than any response would have. "Are you just going to stare at me? Don't you have anything to say?" Her voice was sharp, almost taunting. Keanu tilted his head slightly, as if analyzing the situation from a different angle. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried weight. "It's funny. You look at me and see a fraud, but I look at you and see someone trying to convince themselves that they truly belong here." Jacqueline's brow furrowed, caught off guard by his words. Keanu continued, "I've met a lot of people like you. People who think that wearing an expensive uniform, walking these aisles with perfect posture, and stepping on others will make them part of something bigger. But do you know what happens when the uniform comes off, when the door closes, and the plane lands? You're still just you." A heavy silence filled the cabin. The businessman who'd been watching crossed his arms, intrigued. Some socialites in the front row exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one was more affected than Jacqueline. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Then Keanu added, "The problem isn't me sitting in the seat. The problem is that you're afraid that at the end of the day, there's no seat reserved for you in this game." It was as if he had pulled the ground from under her. Jacqueline felt her face heat up. The anger rising in her throat wasn't just because of Keanu's audacity. It was because, deep down, his words had struck exactly where it hurt. "Shut up," she snapped, and then, without thinking, she raised her hand and slapped him across the face. The sharp sound echoed through the cabin. The muffled laughter from before turned into murmurs of shock. Some passengers' mouths fell open in disbelief. Keanu's face turned slightly with the impact, but he didn't react right away. He ran his tongue over the corner of his mouth, tasting a faint trace of blood from a small cut. Then slowly, he turned his gaze back to Jacqueline. Keanu Reeves sat quietly, his face slightly turned from the impact of the slap, yet his expression remained unchanged. There was no anger or surprise in his eyes, only a calm certainty, as if everything had been predetermined. Jacqueline, who had felt in control moments before, now felt her stomach churn, unsure of how to react. A socialite in the front row widened her eyes, recognizing him, but before she could speak, a passenger began recording the scene. The sound of the slap lingered like thunder, and the surrounding passengers were in shock, some holding their breath, others staring in disbelief. The pilot emerged from the cockpit, his expression darkening as he took in the scene and noticed the redness on Keanu's cheek. "What happened here?" he demanded, his voice authoritative. Jacqueline, trying to regain her composure, responded arrogantly, "A passenger who doesn't know his place." The pilot's face hardened. "Do you even know who you're talking about?" he asked incredulously. Jacqueline crossed her arms defiantly. "Honestly, I don't care. If he's causing trouble, he should be removed." The cabin fell silent as the pilot chuckled dryly, then turned to Keanu, removing his cap in a gesture of respect. "This is Keanu Reeves, and he owns this airline," he announced, shattering the mystery. The cabin erupted in murmurs of shock and recognition. Jacqueline froze, her face pale, as the reality of her actions sank in. Social media was about to explode with the unfolding drama. Keanu remained composed, nodding slightly at the pilot. "Thank you for stepping in, but I think it's clear what happened here," he said calmly. Jacqueline's attempt to humiliate him had backfired, leaving her humiliated instead. Her heart pounded as she tried to justify herself, but there was nothing left to say. The businessman who had been observing the scene smirked. "Well, now this just got interesting." The murmurs grew louder, and phones continued to record. Jacqueline felt her heart race as she searched for some defense, but all she found was judgment. Keanu watched her silently, his lack of reaction more unsettling than any outburst. The pilot addressed Jacqueline sternly. "Do you have anything to say?" She stammered, "I didn't know," her voice barely audible. The pilot raised an eyebrow. "And if you had known, would you have treated him differently?" The silence was overwhelming. Jacqueline wanted to respond, but no excuse could change what had happened. The realization that her facade had crumbled terrified her. The passengers, once indifferent gazes, were now disapproving, and the phones captured every moment of her discomfort. Keanu's calm demeanor was the most unnerving of all. He reached for his phone, typed something, and placed it back on the armrest, ignoring Jacqueline's panicked inquiry. The pilot announced an unscheduled landing, and Jacqueline felt the ground disappear beneath her. "No, wait, please," she pleaded, but no one listened. The passengers returned to their seats, and Keanu continued to gaze out the window, unfazed. Agents escorted Jacqueline off the plane, her pleas ignored. As she passed Keanu, she made a final desperate attempt. "Mr. Reeves, I made a mistake. I was stressed. I didn't know who you were." Keanu turned to her, the cabin holding its breath. "You didn't need to know who I am. You just needed to know how to treat people," he said calmly. The words hit her like a hammer. Jacqueline had no arguments left. Keanu turned back to the window, the chapter closed for him. The agents led her away, and as she descended the plane's stairs, the full weight of reality hit her. Her job was gone, her reputation destroyed. She looked back at the plane, but the door was already closing. Inside, Keanu continued his journey, the incident nothing more than a brief turbulence. The plane landed, and passengers disembarked, still processing the events. Jacqueline's story spread rapidly on social media, the video of the slap and her humiliation going viral. Keanu, however, remained unconcerned, walking through the terminal with his backpack, just another traveler in the crowd. Journalists approached him, asking for a comment on the incident. Keanu paused, then replied, "People often confuse luxury with money, but true luxury is in how we treat each other." His words resonated, and the interview went viral. The hashtag luxury is respect trended worldwide. Jacqueline's dismissal was announced, her face plastered across news sites. Any hope of a fresh start seemed impossible. Meanwhile, Keanu's message became a symbol of something greater. In a world where power and money often dominated, he showed that true greatness lies in how we treat others. As social media continued to debate the incident, Keanu was ready for his next flight, living his life without needing to prove anything to anyone. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience. Thank you for watching. If you missed our last story, don't worry, I've got you covered. I'll leave it here for you to watch. Hope you enjoy it. In the world of glitter and glam, some people go to extraordinary lengths to secure their place in the spotlight. And on a particularly memorable evening, one influencer's obsession with status and social media fame led her into a confrontation that would not only backfire, but change her life forever. What happens when a spoiled influencer, known for her lavish lifestyle and million-strong following, decides to humiliate a quiet, unassuming man in a hoodie at one of Los Angeles' most exclusive restaurants? The outcome is as shocking as it is unforgettable, and trust me, you'll never see it coming. Before we dive deeper into this jaw-dropping story, why not take a moment to tell us where you're tuning in from? If you're loving this tale, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow, we've got something even more special lined up. Picture this. It's 7 p.m. in Los Angeles, and the city is alive with the scent of fresh truffles and the sparkle of imported champagne. The parking lot outside Chispaca is an automotive runway, lined with sleek luxury cars that look as if they've been straight off the pages of a fashion magazine. The valet is busy ushering millionaires and celebrities from their cars, and the air practically hums with wealth. Inside, the restaurant is a sanctuary of sophistication. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over pristine linen tablecloths, and waiters glide through the space with the precision of dancers, carrying plates that look like true works of culinary art. Chispaca isn't just a place to eat. It's a symbol of exclusivity. Its clientele is handpicked, and every single table is reserved for those whose last names hold more power than most could ever dream of. It's a place where the ordinary person simply doesn't belong. Or, at least, that's how it was supposed to stay. Then, the door swung open with a flourish. OMG, guys, you won't believe where I am right now. The sharp, theatrical voice of Addison Deo, better known to her millions of followers as Addison, cut through the ambience. Holding her phone high, she beamed at the camera with a perfectly rehearsed smile, clearly used to being the center of attention. Addison wasn't just a social media star. She was an institution. With over 3 million followers and a reputation for flaunting the high life, she knew how to stir the pot. As she strolled into Chispaca, the air around her practically crackled with the kind of self-assuredness that comes only from a deep belief in one's own magnificence. "I'm at Chispaca, the most exclusive restaurant in LA," she announced dramatically, her phone capturing her every move. "I always get what I want, always." She strutted through the restaurant like she owned it, draped in a shimmering dress that clung to her like a second skin, her platinum black hair cascading in perfect waves, and her makeup, though impeccable, gave off an almost artificial vibe. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for signs of admiration or recognition. But to her surprise, the other diners were mostly too engrossed in their own meals to even glance her way. "Guys, do you have any idea how much it costs to eat here?" Addison continued, her voice dripping with theatricality. "The cheapest dish must be worth my personal trainer's rent." She laughed, and her followers flooded the comments section with responses like, "Haha, Addison being Addison," and "OMG, I love this chaos, keep going, queen." Satisfied with the attention, she leaned back in her seat and scanned the room with a look of barely concealed disdain, clearly expecting more of the same adoration she was used to receiving online. "Luxury, am I right?" Addison said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I swear, places like this need to live up to the hype, or I'm going to expose them in my stories. I've seen better food at a cafeteria." Her followers, always ready for a dose of drama, encouraged her every step of the way. "Yes, expose them, queen." One wrote, "Love when you do these raw, honest reviews." Another comment read, "I can just imagine the peasants gasping right now." But then, something unexpected happened. Something that would completely derail her self-absorbed performance and alter the course of her night. In the quietest corner of the room, at a table so unobtrusive it was almost invisible, sat a man. He wore a simple dark blue hoodie, and unlike the other diners who were dressed to the nines, he seemed out of place. His head was lowered as he ate slowly, seemingly indifferent to the glitzy world around him. He wasn't posing for photos or casting glances, nor was he trying to make an impression. He was simply there, eating his meal in peace, lost in his own little world. This man didn't appear to care about the flashing cameras, the luxury, or the social media circus unfolding at the other end of the room. To Addison, he seemed like a perfect candidate for ridicule. Her followers began to notice, and the comments started to flood in. "OMG, who's that guy behind you? He looks so familiar. one follower posted. Wait, is that? No way. But Addison, too caught up in her own performance, didn't yet realize the significance of this random man. She was oblivious to the fact that she had just captured the attention of someone who would completely change the trajectory of her night. And worse, she was about to make the worst mistake of her life. Addison, focused solely on her live stream, swiped her finger across the screen to adjust her angle. Her fingers paused for a moment as she frowned. Something was off. No matter how she adjusted her position, that man in the blue hoodie was still in the shot. The comments grew louder. That guy in the background is so out of place. He's just sitting there like a total weirdo. Addison's frustration began to show. Ugh, I can't get this right. He's totally messing up my vibe, she muttered to herself, her voice tinged with annoyance. With a forced, sugar-sweet smile plastered on her face, she got up and made her way toward the man. Her phone was still held high, broadcasting the whole exchange to her millions of followers. Hey there, sir, she cooed, her voice now dripping with false politeness. Would you mind moving out of my shot? I need a more aesthetic background for my video. The man didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained lowered, still lost in his meal, completely unaware that he was about to become the target of her ridicule. What Addison didn't know, though, was that the man sitting there wasn't just any regular diner. He wasn't just an unimportant background character in her Instagram story. And at that very moment, he was about to show her that sometimes it's not the loudest voices that deserve the spotlight. But I bet you're wondering, who was this man? Why was he so unfazed by her outburst? And most importantly, how would this whole drama unfold? The truth is, the man Addison was trying to humiliate wasn't just any ordinary person. In fact, he was someone she could never have imagined. A person who was about to flip the entire situation on its head. Stay tuned, because the real twist is just about to begin. The man slowly lifted his eyes, locking his gaze with hers. His expression was calm, unbothered, like he had just stepped out of the quietest of rooms. He blinked once, then again, and after setting his fork down delicately, he wiped the corners of his mouth with his napkin. As he did so, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips, and the words he spoke next hit her like a thunderclap. The real world doesn't have filters, Mississippi. Addison froze. The comments section on her live stream exploded in an instant, flashing on her screen faster than she could process them. What? Did he just throw shade at her? One comment read. Who is this guy? I like him. Another one chimed in. Addison blinked a few times, caught completely off guard. What was this guy even talking about? He wasn't playing along with the show, the spectacle she had carefully curated for her millions of followers. She let out a nervous, breathy laugh, her usual cool evaporating. Yeah, sure, she stammered, trying to regain control. But this is an important live stream, you know? She pointed at her phone as if she needed to explain something as obvious as the air they were both breathing. The man didn't respond. He simply shrugged and returned to his meal, tearing a piece of bread with an unhurried, almost deliberate pace. The silence between them was thick, charged with an energy that made Addison feel a slight heat creeping up her face. Something wasn't right. Around the restaurant, the first few patrons started to notice the small exchange. Glances were exchanged, murmurs rose. For the first time in the evening, Addison felt a weight she had never had to carry before. The feeling that she was losing control of the situation. The bright lights of her live stream, the world she usually dominated, suddenly seemed far away. She crossed her arms defensively, trying to mask the unease that was starting to build within her. Oh, I get it, she said, her voice dripping with feigned sarcasm. You want attention, right? She rolled her eyes, her smile a little too wide, a little too forced. I totally support that, sir, but there are way cooler ways to go about it. The man remained completely unfazed. His focus was entirely on his meal, as if the drama unfolding in front of him was nothing more than background noise. Irritation began to knot in Addison's chest. This wasn't going according to plan. She needed to steer this conversation back to where it belonged. In her hands, she took a deep breath, steeling herself. Anyway, guys, she said, her voice suddenly bright and rehearsed again. "I try to be polite, but some people just don't understand the concept of collaboration, right?" The comments exploded again, but this time, there was a noticeable shift in tone. "Haha, this guy's iconic," one comment said. "He just owned you with class." Another read, "Addison, you're being a bit harsh, don't you think?" For the first time in her career, Addison realized she wasn't 100% in control of the narrative anymore. The man in the dark blue hoodie, sitting there so calmly and so indifferent to the game she was playing, had turned the tables on her in a way she hadn't seen coming. Worse still, he didn't care at all. His relaxed demeanor was ruining everything she had worked so hard to build. Nearby tables were now whispering. Patrons were sneaking glances, trying to piece together what exactly was going on. And though Addison could feel their eyes on her, she refused to back down. No way. She couldn't show weakness. Turning back to the man, she kept her voice steady but strained. "Seriously, can't you just, I don't know, move to another table? It'll be quick." He raised an eyebrow, staring at her for a beat. "I like this table." That was the final straw. Addison's patience snapped. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in deep, mentally counting to 3. When she opened them again, her gaze was razor-sharp, her voice dripping with thinly veiled disdain. "Sir, I don't know if you've noticed, but this is a high-end restaurant," she said, her tone carrying a venomous edge. "The least we expect here is a little self-awareness." The man simply smiled, finishing his bite of food at his own leisurely pace. "Self-awareness," he repeated, as if savoring the word on his tongue. Addison scoffed. "Exactly." She shifted on her feet, suddenly adopting an air of faux compassion, turning back to the camera. "Since you seem so comfortable here, I'll give you some free advice. Have you ever heard of energy? High vibrations? This place is all about maintaining a high frequency, you know? And honestly, sir," she paused, a smile curving up at the corners of her lips, "you seem kind of drained. Maybe a salt bath would help." Silence fell over the restaurant like a heavy curtain. Addison's words hung in the air, and the reaction was swift. Her followers, usually eager to back her every move, weren't so sure this time. The comments were now filled with awkward laughter and secondhand embarrassment. "Oof, that was kind of weird," one comment said. "Addison, I think you went a bit too far," another added. Yikes. But Addison, ever the performer, thought she had one. She was still convinced that she was in control. "What?" she said, brushing it off. "It's not a big deal, guys. Who hasn't messed around a little?" She turned back to the man, flashing a forced, dazzling smile. But something was off. The chat took an unexpected turn. "Wait, I think I know that guy. OMG, no way, Addison. Get out of there before it's too late." Addison frowned, completely confused. What were her followers talking about? She quickly scrolled through the comments, her fingers racing across the screen. Her stomach sank as the truth hit her like a freight train. She recognized the name now. The man in the dark blue hoodie was none other than Keanu Reeves. Keanu Reeves. The Keanu Reeves. A living legend. One of the most beloved actors in Hollywood. A man known not just for his unparalleled talent, but for his down-to-earth personality and kind heart. The same man she had just humiliated in front of millions of people. Her blood turned cold. Her face went pale. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. It couldn't be him. There was no way. But as her gaze flicked back to the man sitting across from her, his serene expression felt all too familiar now. The entire restaurant had caught on. Patrons were whispering in hushed tones. Phones were coming out to record the scene. And Addison's carefully constructed world was moments away from crumbling to dust. Trying to save face, she forced a laugh, though it felt hollow and uncomfortable in her throat. "Oh, come on, guys. You're overreacting. Of course I know who he is. Keanu's a cool actor and all, but no one's untouchable, right?" Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't react. He simply stared at her, calm and unbothered. The silence stretched out, thick with the weight of everything she had just done. He didn't need to say a word to have the room's attention. His presence was overwhelming, his calmness disarming, and somehow that made Addison feel smaller than she ever had before. Desperate to flip the narrative, she turned back to her camera. "Guys, seriously, it's not a big deal. Who hasn't messed around a little, right?" Her voice trembled, but she tried to sound confident. And then, in the silence of that restaurant, Keanu Reeves finally spoke. He placed his napkin on the table, looked her directly in the eyes, and said the words that would destroy her. "Why don't you just leave me alone, Addison?" Addison's face drained of color. The final curtain had dropped, and her fall from grace had just begun. Addison Lux stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, as she faced Keanu Reeves, the man who had just shattered her carefully constructed world. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted, a palpable tension filling the air. The waiters had come to a halt, their movements suspended in mid-action. The patrons, once absorbed in their own meals, were now sitting on the edge of their seats, eyes glued to the unfolding drama. The unmistakable sound of smartphones being lifted filled the room, each camera poised to capture the spectacle. Keanu Reeves, undeterred by the scene, calmly placed his napkin on the table, his movements deliberate, as if time itself had slowed down around him. He then looked up at Addison, his gaze unwavering, a quiet kind of devastation in his eyes. It wasn't anger nor irritation that radiated from him. It was something more profound, compassion, not pity, but a somber understanding, as though he was witnessing a tragic inevitability. And then, in the calmest, most measured voice imaginable, Keanu spoke the words that would haunt Addison for the rest of her life. "You know, I never had to beg for attention online to feel relevant." The words cut through the air like a blade, silencing the room. The entire restaurant froze. The laughter, the murmurs, everything stopped. For a brief moment, it felt as though the world held its breath. Addison's smile, once confident and assured, faltered and stiffened on her face. She had no comeback. The words had landed with surgical precision, rendering her speechless. The live chat on her phone exploded into chaos, but Addison was too stunned to react. Her fingers shook as she read the comments, the flood of messages tumbling over each other. There was no defending herself now. Keanu took a slow sip of his wine, not a single glance toward the camera, as if the entire situation were beneath him. Or perhaps it simply didn't matter to him. To Keanu, it was just another moment in a life he had mastered, untouched by the antics of the online world. But to Addison, it was everything. This was the moment that unraveled her. The moment when the veil of control she had so carefully draped over her life was torn apart in an instant. Her face flushed with embarrassment. She couldn't let it stand. She had to respond. She had to regain control, to defend herself, to prove that she was still in charge. But the rage that simmered beneath the surface was now rising, and with it came the familiar sting of shame. How had it come to this? "Oh, great," she sneered, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and panic. "Now you're going to hit me with some deep wisdom? Who do you think you are?" Her voice shook, and she could feel the eyes of every person in the room on her. The patrons, the staff, they were all watching, and for the first time in her career, Addison felt the overwhelming weight of judgment. The whispers began, subtle at first, but growing louder as the realization spread through the restaurant. People were turning to each other, exchanging knowing glances. Some were recording, others were typing frantically into their phones. For a brief, fleeting moment, Addison saw the truth. She was no longer the queen of her live stream, the charismatic influencer who controlled every narrative. She was alone. The people she had once commanded with her charm were now distant, no longer on her side. But Addison wasn't ready to concede just yet. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and tried again. "You might be famous, Keanu Reeves," she said, her voice forced, "but I'm the new generation." She turned toward the camera, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "People like him are over. This is the future. And if he doesn't get it, that's his loss." A heavy silence descended on the restaurant. And then, Keanu chuckled. It was low, almost inaudible, but it cut through the tension like a knife. The sound of it echoed in the room, and it was enough to make Addison's stomach churn. It wasn't mocking, not at all. It was something else, something far worse. Keanu lifted his gaze again, that small, knowing smile still tugging at his lips. And then he spoke, his words once again hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. "The problem with the new generation isn't the future they create," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "It's the emptiness they leave behind." Boom. The words landed like a thunderclap, shaking the foundation of everything Addison thought she knew. Gasps rippled through the room. The live chat on her phone went into overdrive, the comments now overwhelmingly in Keanu's favor. Addison's heart raced. She had no response, no retort. She had been beaten, not just in the argument, but in every sense of the word. Her carefully curated image, her carefully constructed world, was crumbling around her. The fury that had built up inside Addison now exploded. Her face was hot with humiliation, and her hands clenched into fists, trembling with rage. She couldn't back down. She wouldn't. She was Addison Lux. She couldn't lose like this. In a desperate, almost instinctual move, Addison swung her fist toward Keanu. The strike was fast, fueled by hatred, by the desperate need to regain control of a situation that was slipping through her fingers. But Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't even move. He simply raised one hand, and in one smooth motion, he caught her wrist mid-air. Addison's heart stopped. Her arm trembled, and for a moment, she couldn't pull away. His grip was firm, but it wasn't aggressive. It wasn't violent. It was just unyielding. Keanu held her wrist with the kind of quiet strength that left her powerless to do anything but stare into his eyes. His expression held no anger, no malice, just pity. Pity for the woman who had built her life on arrogance and shallow validation. And that was when it hit her. The realization, sharp and cold, pierced her heart. The rage drained from her, leaving only a deep, searing shame. The illusion of control she had lived with for so long shattered in that moment. She was no longer in charge of the narrative. She was no longer the center of attention. In that one quiet, effortless gesture, Keanu had stripped her of everything. Without a word, he released her wrist, his eyes never leaving hers. Addison's hand hung limp at her side, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on her. She staggered backward, her heels slipping on the polished floor, and for a brief moment, her phone wobbled dangerously in her hand. Keanu sighed, his gaze returning to his meal, completely indifferent to the chaos he had just caused. He took a final sip of his wine and resumed eating, as if nothing had happened. But for Addison, the world had just ended. The restaurant erupted in laughter. It wasn't cruel, not exactly. It was a release, a collective exhale as the tension broke. The sound of it was deafening. But for Addison, it was the sound of her humiliation being sealed, immortalized in real time. Phones were recording every second, and the comments on her live stream were now an uncontrollable avalanche of mockery and scorn. She couldn't take it anymore. Her face was burning, her pride in tatters. She needed to escape, but before she could take a single step, the voice of the restaurant manager sliced through the air, sharp and unwavering. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the restaurant immediately," he said, his expression cold, his stance unyielding. Addison's heart skipped a beat. Her mind raced. "You're joking, right?" she said, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "Do you know who I am?" The manager didn't blink. "Here at Cheese Spacca, we value respect and the experience of our guests. And you, miss, clearly do not meet that standard." Addison felt her face burn with humiliation, but she was beyond caring. She looked around, expecting someone to defend her, to stand up for her. But no one did. The guests stared back at her blankly, their expressions neutral. Some even seemed to take satisfaction in the situation. And then, it hit her. She was utterly alone. "This is ridiculous," she exploded, crossing her arms. "I'm going to cancel this restaurant. You're all screwed. My followers will destroy you." Keanu, still sitting calmly at his table, didn't even look up. He merely gave her a faint, knowing smile. "Are you sure?" he murmured, taking another sip of his wine. Addison's stomach dropped. She turned toward her phone, her fingers trembling as she tried to find some support. But the comments had changed. They were no longer on her side. "Girl, I think you already lost this battle. Addison, stop embarrassing yourself. This is painful to watch. Read the room, woman. You messed with the wrong guy." Her heart sank. It was over. She had lost not just the argument, not just control of the narrative, but her entire identity. The manager's cold words sealed her fate. "Our staff will escort you to the exit." Addison's world collapsed. She had no choice. With a last, furious glance at the restaurant, she turned and marched toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She was furious, defeated, and utterly broken. As she stepped through the door, the entire restaurant erupted into applause. It wasn't forced. It wasn't out of cruelty. It was relief. And in the midst of it all, Keanu Reeves simply went back to eating, as though nothing had happened. For him, it hadn't. But for Addison, this was the beginning of her worst nightmare. And little did she know, her downfall was only just beginning. As she climbed into her car, trembling with rage, she pulled out her phone, her live stream still running. 4.3 million people were watching. But the comments weren't the same. The support she had expected was nowhere to be found. The memes started soon after, flooding the internet. Her face, frozen in shock, became the perfect symbol of her downfall. The captions were merciless. "When you pick a fight with the wrong person, no filter can fix this. High vibrations? More like high delusions." But the worst was yet to come. The emails started arriving. The entire world was talking about what had happened. Addison Lux's public humiliation had become one of the most talked about moments on the internet. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a joke. But the one thing that made her burn with shame more than anything else was that Keanu Reeves never said a word about it. He didn't need to. And that, more than anything else, destroyed her. She wanted him to react, to give an interview, to acknowledge her existence. But he never did. And in that silence, Addison understood that her battle had already been lost. Keanu Reeves simply carried on with his life, unfazed by the chaos that exploded across social media. While the virtual world watched Addison Lux's empire crumble, he strolled peacefully through the streets of Los Angeles, sipping coffee at a quiet cafe, riding his motorcycle, and living as if the public collapse of her world was the least of his concerns. The best response he could offer was, in fact, no response at all. Silence. His indifference was his most powerful statement, a quiet testament to the fact that those who truly matter don't need to shout for attention. By the end of the week, a journalist managed to slip into Chi Spacca, gaining access to the restaurant's guest book. Flipping through its pages, the journalist paused at a signature that caught his eye: Keanu Reeves. Beneath his name, written in elegant, simple handwriting, was a short but impactful message in black ink. True influence isn't measured by what you flaunt, but by what you share with the world. The photo of the message was snapped, posted online, and, of course, went viral. The world went wild, sharing the profound words of a man who had silently defeated Addison with nothing more than his calm demeanor. Meanwhile, Addison, sitting alone in the darkness of her apartment, watched everything unfold in real time. The empire she had built from nothing had crumbled before her eyes. Sponsors disappeared. Partnerships evaporated. Her engagement plummeted. Admiration turned to ridicule. And out there, Keanu Reeves continued his life, as quiet and unaffected as ever. He walked the streets of Los Angeles, dressed in a simple dark blue hoodie, unbothered by the noise around him. Because, to him, nothing had changed. He never asked for the spotlight. He never needed to defend himself. Those who are truly relevant don't need to prove anything to anyone. In the end, Addison Lux wasn't a real threat. She was just another person desperately trying to stay in the spotlight, to be remembered at any cost. In a world where so many shout for attention, Keanu reminded us that true respect is earned in silence. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience.